Hello everyone. Today we're going to look at populating these two grid views with some of our database data. And these grid views have a little bit more complexity because of the logic that we're assigning to them. And it's going to be a little bit more complicated. We're going to have to use something called a join to pull the right data into our database here. Excuse me, from our database into our grid view here. Right, this is the checked out books table, so we just want books that are checked out and in particular by that user. But we're also going to look at a case, the admin version of this platform, where we just give them all the data. So we're going to handle both of those cases. And then our checkout records, we will be applying the same logic. We're going to keep it user specific, but also have an admin version. So it's going to end up being 4 queries, or actually we're able to do a shortcut and reduce the number of that. But before we get into the inner joins and the specifics of the grid views and the queries, I'd like to just go over how the program flows and operates, go a little bit over how the database is structured and how I've built my data so that the query and the inner join makes sense. It's very important to understand the big picture before you try to just understand the SQL query itself. So let's get started with just a quick rundown of how the program is populating these grid views. So if you've seen other videos, you should be familiar, but if you haven't, I'll just go over real quick. We're updating the data source of the grid views, and from the data source, we assign it these list values here. These list values get populated by our service class here, which is our library book manager. This service class is creating public members that are lists. So that's what gets assigned to the data source. And then these get their list values from the interface book repository where I've built the queries. I've already populated all the code, so we are going to work from that standpoint. I want to go over the database. We'll go over the database when we go over the queries. So jumping into the code now where we start to implement our queries, the first thing to note is I've added 2 interface methods here for our iBook repository. We're going to have get checkout records, so that's going to be for one grid view, and get library books for user, and that'll be for the other grid view. So pretty straightforward. One value should go for one grid view, the other value will go for the other grid view. Let's have the user form open so that we can just see which grid views we're talking about. I can reference them. So this is the right-hand side of the application. This is the library books, get checked out books. Library books are the ones that are checked out, and checkout record is the history of when the book was checked out. So our mock, our testing library, is just returning empty lists. Probably should put a test record in there. I'll probably do that in the future. But for now, we'll just we'll leave these blank. We just wanted to implement them so that we would get a happy compiler. But for now, our focus will be on the SQLite query here. So the first one I think we should go over, we got the checkout records. This is the one, this is the meat and bones here. So this is the one that has the more complicated inner join for our grid view. That's going to be our lower one here. This is the grid view that says the minute I click reserve book, we're going to get information about when that person clicked for that book, and more specifically the book and the user. So it collects all of that information. It really, it's the ultimate table. It has everything. And you'll see that that's useful later for populating this grid view. We can actually just piggyback off this one. But without getting ahead of myself, let's focus on how this grid view is getting populated. So here we have two queries. And as you can see, I have this if-else statement looking for is librarian. Very quickly, I'll show that I added this Boolean that in our user class just to check if the user is a librarian. That's our admin user. Our admin user is going to be able to see everything. So that's what we're doing. We're using the polymorphic, the user class, the base class that has this information stored into it. So if it's a librarian, we're going to do one query, which shows everything. If it's not a librarian user, then we're going to look at the specific user and only show the user those specific records. And so that comes down with this where statement. That's our filter. And there is no where statement in our user librarian. But let's look a little bit closer at the queries themselves. I'm going to unpin this so that we can get a bigger view here. So the first query that we're going to run, you'll see all of this other code is the standard boilerplate that we're used to seeing. Connection, command, reader, and then in the reader, we're just pulling the data off the row. And then we have that while reader because it's reading multiple rows. But the query itself here has this select statement from multiple tables. So what you'll see here is we are renaming the table here from current records to CR. So anywhere you see CR dot, I'm saying look at the checkout records and then grab that piece of information. So here we have the as statement. That's just renaming it in our query. It's not renaming the table, it's the column in the table itself. It's just renaming it as our value that we're going to get back. So we're pulling everything from the checkout records, and let's look at our checkout records table just to kind of have these side by side to see what's going on here. So the checkout records here, we're grabbing the ID, we're grabbing the user ID, the checkout date, the due date, and the return date. We are also getting the library book ID, but not from this table. We're also, this is a join query. So a join query is bringing two tables together. We're bringing two tables together here to pull both sets of column data. And so what we're going to also pull is the ID. So we have this join here is saying that we're using another table too. We're going to use this library books table. And then the on statement is saying which piece of information from both tables needs to match. So if we look at our current records table here, we have a library book ID of 4. So we are going to look at the library book ID and we're going to match it with library books. So this ID here, we're going to match it with this piece of information. So all of this information will get brought in with that checkout record that uses that library book ID. So that row will have, this row will have 1, 1, 4, this piece of information, and also the library book ID 4, and all of this information. So that's what this join is doing here. This join is bringing that bringing information from both tables and linking it on that matching field. And that's all we need to do to query for the user librarian. And for a specific user, we are doing a where filter, which says the user, it must be for that specific user. So on the checkout records, we have a user ID table here. And so if I log in with whoever user ID 1 is. We can look at that real quick. User ID 1 is Alan Turing. Only this record and this record will show up when Alan Turing logs into our application. Now the library user will see everything because we don't filter that individual's code. We only filter the code for the non-librarian user. And that's how the inner join works. That's how we can pull information from our SQLite database and then read it into some values here and populate that list. At the end of all of this, at the top of my function here, we have checkout records. That's my list that is going to be populated and assigned to the Gridview data source. I have my list. I'm populating my list. And you'll see here, I'm just, this is just data. These values here are just data being pulled from the queries. I believe book ID is also being pulled from the queries. Yes, it is. We have book ID. But then you'll notice I'm creating these book and library book classes, which might be a little bit strange. Like, hey, we already have a book list that already has all those classes. And we have this checked out book that already has all those classes. So what's going on here? Well, I'm actually saving these books. The general information is the book class, and then the library book is the specific class. So let's pull up the database again here, just so we can see. So we have the general information that just describes a book, and then the library book, which says this is the physical copy of the book. I'm saving those into the checkout records. But why? So one way to visualize how this database is actually working is inside of, well, real quick, I'm not saving the book class to the checkout record. I'm saving the book class to the library book. So one way to visualize how this is absorbing the information, this book ID right here, you can think of it as more than just a number. You can think of it as the entire book class, because the way the database works is this is your lookup, this is your reference, this is how you get back to the other table. So you could think of this row here as, yes, it has a copy, yes, it has a status of if it's available or not, but it also contains everything in this row, all of this information. And so that's why I'm storing not just the ID inside of my library book class here, I'm bringing in the entire book class, because that'll be useful if I want to look up the title, author, and genre in the future. I don't need to reuse my database, because inside of my library book class, this ID is the book itself. So now all that information is linked together. And then I did the same thing for the checkout records, where each has a library book ID. So ID 4 here is linked to ID 4 on the library books table. So my library books table, my ID is linked to my library book ID here. So then I put the library book ID, which is number 4 in this particular example I'm explaining. It's going into, the class is going into the checkout records class here. You can see I'm not just putting, this is not just a regular integer or boolean. This is the library book class, which contains integers and booleans, but that also contains a nested book class. And then the book class only has raw data. And I didn't go over what this is. This is just pulling existing data. This is a simple little for loop that just goes through my book class, my books. It goes through my books. I sent my book class in here as I sent them in as parameters. Same with the user. So I'm holding these two classes. I'm bringing them around with me into these into my methods here. If I bring in the user information and I bring in the book information, I'm able to leverage that information with my book lookup, my checkout record lookup. I'm able to leverage this information and simplify my query a lot, actually, because otherwise I'd have to include inside my query a lot more information. I'd have to expand my query to include the book. I would have to join on the book class as well. But I already have the book class inside of my program. And so rather than adding more data to my query, it's better if you have the book, if you already have the information available locally inside your program, which we do. The first thing that we do with our program here is we pull up this book information. So the minute I perform that query, I store that information locally. That's called caching. So I'm going to cache that information locally, and then I'm able to use it later at a later point, and it's a lot quicker, it's a lot faster to work with local data than to keep going back to my database. If you're using a database server, this is SQLite, it's not a server, but let's assume good programming principles in that you're using a server. You want to minimize the times you have to go to that server and pull information. And so by performing this little loop here on our self-stored information that's temporarily stored when the program opens, I pull the book out of it, just like I pull the user out of it. In fact, I have to pull the user out this way because that's a local variable defined by the person logging in the first place. So I have to use the user variable this way, but I reduce the need to keep querying information if I use the book class this way as well. So not only are we looking at joins and the proper way to pull data from our query and pull it from our database, it's also important to consider, how can I avoid using a bunch of joins when possible, because then your data will run a lot faster. Once your database gets really big, and once you start working with a lot of different tables, your data it might take time. It could take seconds or even a minute if you are pulling a lot of data, and you don't want that user to feel that latency. So if you can bring in local data, always bring in local data. And so that's what we're doing with the book class here. And then at the end of this, all we do is send the checkout record to the user, the user grid view here, the user's grid view, the GUI. We send this information back. We have a list that's created, and I'm pointing to the wrong one. It's actually this grid view here. And real quick, this other query for this grid view is actually pretty simple. So I'm going to go over that, even though this video is a little bit long. I want to try and bring these together because they're very similar. So to populate this grid view, we actually don't even need to query anything for the user. For the librarian user, we do a very simple query, which is, so you can see here I have the logic of two if-else here, just two circumstances, two situations. If it's a librarian user, we perform a very simple query which just says select everything from the library book table and just show all the library books. And that's all this is doing. I don't want to go into too much detail here. It's identical to the way we did our book list and the user combo box. So feel free to look at those videos if you want. But that's all that's doing. And we're sending in the books class. Again, because it's locally stored data, we save a lot of time and effort, and we make our program faster using the caching element of the books class there. So we're reusing that data. But we can also reuse the data from the checkout records. And you'll see that the logic that I put in here, it looks a little bit wonky. I went to the library book manager. This is in between the grid view and the database. This is the service class. You'll see I have a little bit of odd or some strange looking if else here and return. But all this is doing is it's seeing if we've already used the checkout records. If we have checkout records cached, which is what it's checking if it's null. If it's null, it's not, it's cached. It's not cached. Only look it up if it's not cached. So we only have to run this query that we did for checkout records once. We only run that query once. And then we can just leverage that information and work locally for speed and optimization. But what my library books repo call here does, get library books, is it pulls that library book out of the checkout record. Remember how I was saying our checkout records, this ID here, this ID 4, is literally storing this information because that's how we built it. We built the checkout record here to store the library book itself. It's storing the library book. And so I don't need to re-query that information. I can just read it from my local repository, from the local cached data that we've saved. And that's right here. So I send that into the method, and of course we send in a little bit more information. We send in the user to see if it's the proper user, and then we send in the books to pull all the librarian books if we need to. But the focus here I'd like to really emphasize is my checkout records cached information has the library books for that person. And then we just do a quick lookup. I don't even think I need this, but it's a safeguard. But this is just checking if the user ID matches. I don't even think we need that, but it's there just in case. But we have here the library book being added to that list. We're just creating our library book list for every checkout record. Now this is very important. Our library books should only show the checkout records that have a return date of null. So these are the books that need to be returned. These are the books that need to be returned. That's my library book table. So this is the only logic that we really need to perform here. In fact, I'm just going to delete this. I don't want this because it adds unnecessary confusion. Because this, I've already performed that. This table already performs that logic, which is check if it's a matching user ID. And yeah, let's run through the program real quick and see how it goes. So here I set up a few debug points. The admin one is the most interesting. I don't think we need to go through the debugger. I think we'll be fine. So here we can see our admin class has access to all this information. I believe this one is user 4 here. Checked out books. Let's get user 4 just to kind of get a contrast and comparison of the two different looking grid views that we have here. Right, so we have our return date. We didn't even need to check for the user. It's this table already checks for the user. So the checkout records in this table, he's only got 2, and then it checks if the return date is null, then these values will show up here. If the return date's not null, those values will not show up here. So we can try and use another user to get a good comparison. But yeah, we have our checkout record, and then I could just use this information and populate it here. That's what we've done. Let's take a look at one more user. Hopefully I can pull up someone that has checkout records. Let's go to let's find someone. Everyone does. Okay. right? Return dates here are not null, so they have no checked out books right now. So that's the logic that we wanted. We've performed the logic that we need to do our inner joins and bring together all of this information. I know this was a long video. Thanks for sticking it out with me. I hope this was instructive. If you have any questions, please let me know, and I'll try to get back to you as soon as I can. But thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Take care. Bye.